If we want to find solutions to today's challenges and build bridges across divides, we need a deeper understanding of global issues. The Pulitzer Center supports journalists all over the world who report on topics like climate change, public health, migration, and more. We share that reporting through public events that engage wide audiences and lesson plans that inspire the next generation. Support journalism and education for the public good. Become a Pulitzer Center champion today.
Hi, my name is Kaina Zamaria, and I'm the visuals editor at Vox. Super Trees was a project that we did to highlight these fantastic, incredible, super trees around the world that have an incredible ecological impact. Part of wanting to highlight these trees is they are in danger. The ecology is in danger. The encroachment of production and human sort of needs are impacting the livelihoods of these trees. My mission, my goal as the visuals editor was to get people to fall in love with these trees. The use of photography with graphics, with text, was all a way to create an experience for the audience and really immerse them into these stories. One thing that Super Trees has taught me is that framing is really important. And one of the things that we did early on was sort of talk about the trees as having a superpower, which is very relatable and very easy to understand. You can frame a really complicated story in an easy way that's easy to understand, that brings wonder back into science and ecology, but also gives you the facts as well. The way that you tell a story and the way that you put a story together matters. Oftentimes our audience, doesn't just want doom and gloom, but really wants to not only understand and then say, one, how am I a part of this and how am I implicated, and also what can I do? What sort of personal behaviors can I change, or who can I support if I feel like, I don't like the way things are going. And so, we do keep that in mind, where we don't want to leave the audience completely devastated and feel hopeless. We did offer some solutions further down into the story if people were really sort of motivated to act or to change their behavior. But my goal when I'm building this is to always think about, what does the audience need in order to care? The awards are great. They're a great recognition of the work. I think what's the most rewarding is seeing the project on different syllabuses across the country, on seeing students learning about these trees from a young age, even on seeing some major philanthropic folks decide to put some energy and some money towards, reforestation, mangrove projects. That all was wonderful to see. It really shows that you can coordinate a pretty complex group of journalists to have one mission and to create something so cohesive that spans 3 countries around the world. Having trust and constantly thinking about our audience and what they need, and serving the story all make for a really rewarding collaborative experience. I will say the Pulitzer Center support was a huge part in allowing us to accomplish this really ambitious type of story.
Welcome to Beyond Mother Earth. This is day 2 of Environment Redefined, the 2021 quarter, and I hope you enjoyed learning more from joining us. Please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. For those who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our staff and our work are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world, bringing together this work by themes on our website, not only environment, but also racial justice, migration, public health, and more. We don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. Environment Redefined is the Pulitzer Center's 4th annual conference. In past years, we've explored topics of gender, peace and conflict, and religion. Last year, in canceled because of the pandemic, we hosted an online series focused on justice issues. We're joining us this year for our, and if you're inspired by what you hear today, please consider station among the panel questions from the audience. Time by using the Q&A icon. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you cannot hear us, please let us know via the chat box. We are recording the session to post online. We are also live tweeting, and you can join the conversation with the hashtag Environment Redefined. And one final note, please stay online once the session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the session. Sara Shipley Hiles is an associate practice professor at the Missouri School of Journalism. She teaches reporting, writing, and online journalism. Her areas of interest include environmental science and health reporting using multimedia and social media and investigative reporting. Sara is a board member of the Society of Environmental Journalists. Thank you, Sara. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting this panel today. I am thrilled to be able to share this conversation with several very talented women journalists who have done some amazing work around the world that you'll be hearing about shortly. So I'll be introducing each of our 3 panelists. And then after I finish those introductions, each panelist will have a few minutes to share some of their work with you. I'm going to start with Danielle Villasana. She's an independent photojournalist based in Istanbul. She's filling in today for Nicole Cebecky, who is on assignment. Danielle's work focuses on human rights, gender, health, and migration worldwide. She's a National Geographic Explorer, a Magnum Foundation awardee, and an International Women's Media Foundation Fellow. She believes strongly in the pairing of photography with community development and education, which has led to her involvement in various grassroots photo organizations. She's co-founder of We Women on the community team of the Everyday Projects, board member of the Authority Collective, co-author of the Photo Bill of Rights, and a member of Ayun Fotografas and Women Photograph. Today, Danielle will be representing the work of photographer and filmmaker Nicole Cebecky, one of 8 Everyday Projects photographers who contributed to the Women on the Move story published in National Geographic and led by Danielle. Nicole's work from Somaliland highlights how the pastoral way of life is ending in the Horn of Africa as climate change intensifies droughts and forces people from their land, with women and girls bearing the brunt of extreme weather. Our next panelist will be Neha Wadikar. Neha is an independent multimedia journalist reporting across Africa and parts of the Middle East. Her written and video work has been published in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, among others. She's received fellowships from the Pulitzer Center, the International Women's Media Foundation. She is passionate about telling stories that affect women and girls on topics ranging from women's political participation in government to sexual and reproductive health and rights to gender and climate change. Today, Neha will represent her work from Kenya for Time, Vice News, and other outlets. She investigated how climate change is killing livestock and prompting families to sell their daughters off for dowry money. And our 3rd panelist is Nadia Pontes. Nadia is an experienced Brazilian editor and multimedia journalist covering environmental issues in Brazil. She has worked for Deutsche Welle in Germany and has been working as a correspondent for international outlets since 2015. Today, Nadia will present her work from Brazil for Manga Bay and other outlets. She's documented how the women of the Xingu Indigenous territory are coming together to fight for their land as it's threatened by climate change, land developers, and government policy. And now that I have done the introductions, I'd like to hand it over to our 3 panelists who will each share a bit of their work.
Hi, thank you so much, Sarah, for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. Filling in Nicole Cebecky's shoes cannot be done ever, but I will try my best. And thank you, of course, to the Pulitzer Center for the invitation to share our project with all of you. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Danielle Villasana, and I'm a community team member of the Everyday Projects, which is a global network of storytellers all committed to using imagery to combat harmful misperceptions and to rise above inequality, both within the visual media industry and beyond. And 8 women photographers from our network came together to work on a documentary project about the impact of migration on women worldwide, which was ultimately published in National Geographic's February issue. And our project spanned more than 15 communities worldwide, and you can see a brief snapshot there of our stories. So, and it's online as well. So if you didn't have a chance to pick up the February issue, I urge all of you to check it out online as well. So with that, we'll dig right into one of the 8 stories, again by Nicole Cebecky. And I think we can flip to the next slide. Yes, thank you so much. So the World Bank estimates that by 2050, 143 million people around the world will be forced to leave their homes to escape the effects of climate change. And though Somalia has long been beset by extremes, climate and environmental changes are compounding these problems and leading to the end of a way of life. For example, in 2011, a severe drought pushed tens of thousands of Somalis from their homes, swelling the ranks of Kenya's Dadaab refugee camp. And the link between drought and hunger is horribly clear. But drought also increases the risk of another kind of danger, which is often more hidden, the risk of violence against women and girls. And drought separates families and often forces women to travel further in search of food and water, putting them at greater risk of violence. And they face a triple burden in some cases: to survive, to care for their families on their own, and evade sexual violence in the process. Violence against women is also common within IDP camps, where societal ties and traditional forms of security are broken down, and new arrivals are forced to live in the outskirts of overcrowded camps and makeshift tents situated in poorly lit alleys. So refugee girls also face the additional risk of early and forced marriage, often because their families simply can't support them. With the World Bank's estimate, countless more Somalis will likely be pushed from their homes, with women and girls, again, bearing the weight of these unique challenges brought on by displacement. With this weather pattern, Somalia or Somalis will not survive, said environmentalist Fatima Jibril. Maybe the land, a piece of desert called Somalia, will exist on the map of the world, but Somalis cannot survive. And as one of the countries hardest hit by climate change, for this story in When on the Move, Nicole continued her very long-term documentary work on these impacts of environmental disaster on women and how they're coping in the face of these new challenges. And she focused on how some, such as Rahma Hassan Mahmoud and her family, will become IDPs with no clear alternative future. And others will become refugees, crossing an international border in the hope of securing a better life. And for hundreds of thousands of Somalis who have fled war, drought, and famine in their country during recent decades, a better life remains elusive. Stranded in neighboring Kenya and Dadaab, one of the largest refugee camps in the world with nearly 220,000 people, all they can do is mark time. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this issue a bit more later on with Sarah and the other panelists, and looking forward to hearing from Neha and Nadia speak now about their own projects looking at similar issues. So thank you so much.
Kan dhabne amma tapha gartee ijoolleen ariyaasiitii waliin taphattee ayyee waliin tateetu liqeena nu gurguranii nu nagar.
No girl is being married unless she reaches the age of 18 years and above.
The reality of the matter is it's happening, and it's not reported.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who is calling in. And a big thank you to the Pulitzer Center for having me as a speaker and of course for supporting my project. So I am going to build off of the information that Danielle just gave us. My project is a project for Time Magazine. It was a video and text project. And Kenya, which is a neighbor to Somalia, faces a lot of similar issues to those that Danielle just described. My project focused specifically on looking at the impact of climate change and drought on early marriage and the marriage of girls under the age of 18. There was another component of my project that also was supposed to look at climate change and its impact on female genital cutting, but because of COVID-19, we ended up actually changing our project a bit and looking at the impact of COVID. So I'm going to focus on the Time Magazine story for the next few minutes. So I'll begin by saying that early marriage is actually illegal in Kenya. It's banned, and the government is working to try to end early marriage through a number of different ways, including education and reaching out to communities and trying to inform them about the detriments of the practice. And it has worked. In some ways it has worked. So in 1994, for example, the rates of girls between the age of 20 to 24 who were married before their 18th birthday was 34%. And in 2016, which is the year that we have the most recent data available, that number had dropped to 23%. But the issue is that climate change is now reversing or at least hindering the progress of the government and other organizations to end the practice. I'll give you a stat here. So between the years of 1950 and 2000, so 50 years, Kenya had 9 droughts. Droughts are a semi-regular part of the seasons in Kenya. It happens, but it used to happen every 5 to 10 years if you ask people who live in drought-prone areas. In the 20 years since, so from 2000 until 2020, Kenya has already had at least 6 droughts. And so you can imagine if you project that out for the next 30 years, exactly what that's going to look like. But what I'd like to do is frame this as an economic issue. One of the problems with these communities is that they are pastoral communities that depend on their livestock. So they herd camels, goats, and sheep, and that's how they make their living. And so when drought comes, these animals die from starvation, disease, and thirst, which means that families really lose everything. One of the ways, one of the coping mechanisms or negative coping mechanism that families engage in is to marry their daughters off for dowry. And the dowry that these families receive from the husband's or the boy or groom's family is usually livestock, which means that they can actually make their herds grow again. It's about $700 per head for a camel, and so that just gives you a sense of exactly how valuable that is. And so I'm going to show you the last part of the video so you guys can get a chance to see one of the positives. And then I'm looking forward to speaking more with Sara, Nadia, and Danielle after this.
Yaani amma fursaalee gammadee sababu beeksisi yaalee waan qabu warki yaalee naan qarqaara daa'imni kan intaltoo qaba intaltii maqaa ruqiyaa in jaaladha intaltii yaada iskoolii keessanii sii soomtee borillee nangana qarqaartee faamilii yaalee qarqaara.
Nadia, I think you may be muted.
I'm sorry. Now, yes, I think I'm online properly. So good morning from Brazil. It's a pleasure to be here among these amazing women and to talk about our project that was developed by Maria Fernanda Ribeiro and myself. It's a story about women from 16 ethnic groups living in different villages across the Xingu Indigenous territory, and how they started to organize themselves to defend their forests. You see this picture, it shows two women with their body painting, and it means they are prepared to fight. This painting carries deep spiritual significance. Women paint their bodies and faces also for celebrations and to connect to their ancestors and ask for protection. So talking about Xingu Indigenous Territory was the first area reserved exclusively for Indigenous people in Brazil in 1961. Xingu is the name of this important Brazilian river, which flows from Mato Grosso state up to Pará state in the north part of Brazil, until it empties into the Amazon River. The problem in the Xingu River basin is deforestation, and deforestation continues. In the first 4 months, the first 4 months of 2019, when we did our project, more than 36 million trees were cleared in the region. The expansion of monoculture and increased illegal land grabbing are the main reasons behind deforestation. The biggest threat to the indigenous people of Xingu is their neighbors, industrial farmers who grow soybeans and use a lot of agrochemicals. Mato Grosso, where the Xingu Indigenous Territory is located, is the largest soybean exporter. So for you to have an idea. But we were with these women during their first big meeting. So it was a huge thing. 190 women from different villages traveled days by boat. We traveled 3 days to be there with them. And this was an unprecedented gathering in the Ilha Grande Indigenous village. This was also a rare opportunity for these women to learn more about the outside world. They say they deal with a lot of prejudice just because they are women, but they want to overcome this and walk side by side with the men and fight together for their forest. It's important to say that Indigenous women did not have much to say in decision-making processes historically. According to their cultures, men are always responsible for many things. They take care of their family, they defend the family, the territory, the community, and women, they just take care of, not just, but they take care of food, children, and the house. But these women, they decided to change this, especially after they started to receive information of the threats they face. Because this part of Brazil is a very remote part. It's not easy to get access to internet. So these kind of gatherings are very, very important for them. And since President Jair Bolsonaro took office in 2019, Indigenous communities across Brazil are afraid of him, of the promises he made during his campaign. He was elected with the help of powerful agribusiness. Bolsonaro has vowed to freeze demarcations of new indigenous reserves, withdraw the protected status of others, and open reservation lands to agriculture and mining, even in the Amazon rainforest. But according to the Brazilian Constitution, indigenous peoples have the rights to their ancestral lands. So since the first big gathering in May 2019, the Xingu women started to take up positions in indigenous organizations and associations, so they can participate in politics and raise their voices. So it's so important to be here today and talk about them. And I think it's important today, and they know I'm here talking about this movement. They say they want the world to hear, to listen to them. And they believe this will strengthen the role of women by protecting their territory and indigenous rights. So we published an article, a text, and picture gallery at Deutsche Welle, Brazil, in Portuguese. We also produce an audio feature for DW, Deutsche Welle Living Planet program, which brings environment stories from all over the world. We also published an article in a short documentary at Monga Bay. And it was great for the women. After what we noticed is that after bringing them to showing how they are organizing themselves, we started to see them quite often in our national media. Is one feedback we also became from them.
Thank you all so much to all of our panelists for sharing their amazing work. It's very impressive to see the work that you're able to do and how you're able to connect with people on the ground in these different places throughout the world and bring their stories to us. So I'd like to open the conversation now. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask of all the panelists, and people in the audience, feel free at any time to put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on those and bring the questions forward to the panelists. And the first question that I would like to ask has to do with the effects of climate change on the ground. We know that the effects of climate change are not seen and felt the same way everywhere in the world, to the extent that even in the United States here, sometimes we see people still denying that climate change is a thing that's happening, or they may think that it's a far off problem in the future. But in the places where you're reporting from, that really isn't the case. And in fact, in Nicole's story, there was an official with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees who said of Somalia, if anybody still doubts climate change, they just have to come here. And so I wanted to see if you each share a little bit more about what are the actual impacts of climate change that are visible on the ground today, and how are those affecting people? And if you'd like, you can start with Danielle. Thank you.
Sure, no worries. Again, just for anyone who might have joined a little bit later after my presentation, I am filling in for Nicole Cebecky. So she worked on a project about climate change and how that's affecting women and girls specifically in Somaliland and Kenya. So I'm channeling her thoughts today. So yeah, one thing, that Nicole had mentioned that that really stuck with me was how, and as Neha mentioned as well, these communities of pastoralists and in Somaliland and Somalia are used to droughts. They're ready for droughts, they're equipped for droughts. But when they become increasingly frequent, for example, in some parts of Somaliland, in the past 10 years, there have been 9 droughts. These communities are used to a drought maybe once every few years, but when you start having a drought every single year, basically this is, upending those traditional buffers. And these communities have strong coping mechanisms. But again, it becomes a different scenario completely when drought is happening once a decade versus every year. And so another point I think that we should consider when we think about climate change is that ultimately it's an economic issue as well. And as Neha pointed out, people are losing their way of life, their livelihoods, and then as a result, people are pushed to make decisions that they wouldn't normally make, like maybe child marriage, or for example, Nicole shared a story about one of the women that she followed in her story who was sold by her grandmother, and it was simply she just didn't have any other way to support the family. And I think that story eventually had a positive ending. She was able to leave that marriage, but so this is when you start to see systems break down because of climate change and those real effects happening now.
Yeah, and I'll actually share a current story. So you can see I'm in a hotel, and I'm currently in Mozambique, and I'm actually reporting on climate and gender. And this is a place where there have been multiple cyclones that have hit the region. And I've been asking people, when was the last time you grew up here? When did you see a cyclone? And they were like, maybe there was one in 2000, I think. My dad told me. And just in the past 2 years, since 2019, there was Cyclone Idai, which affected 1.8 million people, followed by a tropical storm, another cyclone slightly north of here, and then another one that happened just in January of this year. And, the issues here, although this is slightly different than my project and the one that Nikki worked on, that Nicole worked on, because those focused on drought, this is focusing on basically a different climate disaster with a lot of the same impact. We're looking at rape and sexual violence, early marriage, teenage pregnancy, and higher rates of prostitution because people absolutely have nothing. And, as we keep saying, this is an economic issue fundamentally. So I think whether you are here looking at cyclones, or whether you're in northern Kenya or Somalia looking at drought, the impact is so clear. And just one thing that I think is important is that these are communities that have the lowest carbon footprint in the world. They do not create, greenhouse gases the way that industrialized nations do. They do not have they're not flying around in airplanes. They're not driving SUVs. I mean, they're really not the people who are responsible for climate change, yet they pay the highest price.
Yeah, it's so sad to hear to you, but here in Brazil, the story is quite the same. The indigenous communities, they are the protectors of the forest. But deforestation presents other problems which weigh on the mind of these women. They have been suffering from the heat, they say. They don't give a proper name. They just say, it's warmer than it used to be. But since science shows that these women are right, when an area of forest disappears for cropland, surface temperature can rise up to 5 degrees Celsius. I know Celsius is a scale we use here. It's different for you. I couldn't do the maths right now, but I can say it's a lot, according to the Amazon Environmental Research Institute. The disappearance of forest cover also impacts water. And these women are feeling this impact as well. Without trees, the trees transfer into the air vanishes and rainfall decreases. So converting forests to plantation results in up to 30% reduction in water vapor formation, according to studies of this Amazon Environmental Research Institute. And this water vapor, which will no longer be formed, would become rain somewhere. So it's important as well for the farmers that are all over the Xingu Basin. So they say these women feel a lot that the heat is a problem and also the lack of rainfall, although they are, of course, at the Xingu Basin, but they can feel the difference. They can feel climate change is coming, has arrived actually.
Thank you for sharing that. I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on gender and women and talk a bit more about some of the particular impacts that you're seeing and what that looks like for women there. And then also address how women are becoming leaders and change agents in their own communities.
I guess we can just keep going in order. I'm so glad you brought that up, Sarah, because I was hoping we would talk about that, but how women are, no surprise, the communities that are perhaps the most disadvantaged with all kinds of issues, not just climate change, but also the people in the community who are keeping people together and coming up with solutions and being there for one another. And that was something Nicole mentioned about her work that she's done, is that in almost all of these cases of, early marriage or sexual assault in the IDP camps, really difficult issues like that, women turn to other women. They didn't go to, the leaders of their communities or to men in their communities. They turned to one another. And, she even mentioned, for example, that there was a woman whose daughter was almost trafficked, and she immediately got the police involved, ran after her daughter, and right before her daughter crossed, the international border, they found her, and that mother has since gone on to be a source of strength for others who have faced similar issues. So it's interesting too, that for example, in the Women on the Move project that looks at, all kinds of, critical issues facing our world today and how women are impacted, women are on the go more than ever. Of the more than, 1 billion people who are on the move, nearly half of them are women and girls, but yet their needs aren't being met sufficiently by policymakers. So in that case, women, again, sort of form these really tight-knit communities where they support one another and come up with solutions, the ones taking care of the family, taking care of the children. So, I think that that's something really important, of course, to keep in mind is, not only are women and girls, the community that's always seems to bear the brunt of these issues more, but then the people in the community who are also problem solving. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. It's really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is a great question. So one of the women that I met during my reporting, and the woman really who facilitated my team's introduction to the community that we visited and spoke to, is an activist named Nuria Golo, and she was married when she was 16 against her will, and by the time she was 18, she wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to finish school. Her husband wouldn't let her. And so she left him, and that was a big deal. She's now older, and so especially at the time in the community that she came from, that was a really big deal. And so she also underwent female genital cutting, and it took her, I think, 8 years for her ex-husband to remarry, and for her family, her mom and dad, like her actual mom and dad, to accept her back, because there was so much stigma and so much shame around the fact that she left. But during that time, she finished her education, and she has now remarried, although her ex-husband never gave her any sort of alimony or the things that were owed to her from an Islamic wedding contract. But I tell the story because she is like a fierce advocate for women in Kenya. She is now on government advisory boards. She has a nonprofit organization, and she hosts girls in her house who have run away. She goes to communities, and a lot of these communities have, access to weapons. I mean, they have a fighting spirit, I would say. And they are they're very protective of their customs. And she goes right in there and grabs underage girls and makes sure that she rescues them from being married or cut. And that's one of the things that she's doing. So I think, her story is one of survival, but also to echo what Danielle said, one of, a woman herself who has been through this experience, going back and making sure she protects other girls from her community. And if you watch the rest of the video that we had, she said, I have been through this. I know how painful it is, and I don't want to see any other girl go through this experience. So I think women are the key to solving these issues, because we are the ones who are most affected by them.
Yeah, I would say that the Xingu women realize quite, now that they are the keys as well to solve the problems. in order to play this role as leaders, they have to overcome so many prejudices in their communities. And this is a strong thing among indigenous communities. This is happening at Xingu, but not necessarily in other indigenous territories. It's quite new. And so as the women are the ones that take care of the food, of the children, they are really preoccupied about the future of their children. If the forest disappears, what's going to happen to them? And as the men have not been successful, so to say, in dealing with the politics, and so they decided they want to join the men in this fight. So this is the story we brought up, and I think they are, but I'll tell you a story about a woman we interviewed. He was a young leader. She is a young leader. She was married, but after she started to be part of the movement, the man said, "I don't want you as my woman anymore." And it's a strong cultural thing when the woman is abandoned by the husband, but she decided to keep going, and now she's divorced. But it's a big thing. It's a big stand in her story. And yeah, what I'm glad is that since that gathering, of course, they are now fighting COVID-19. It's a huge thing. They have many difficulties, many deaths. It's so sad. I keep contact with them, but since then they feel more confidence, in being there as a leader, because it's a new thing for them, and they are examples for other women as well in the whole Amazon.
Thank you. That is so inspiring to hear. There are some questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to take a few of those now. Several people have questions about the journalism itself, so I'm going to kind of wrap some of those together into one. One person is asking how should a journalist interested in these stories get involved? How did you start telling these stories? Another person wants to know, how did you do the research and who would you talk to for that? And then another question is, how important is it when you're telling the stories to make sure that they're published in the local languages so that the people that you're covering do have some access to the stories?
Can I comment on this thing about the languages? I read also this question. Well, as the Brazilian government doesn't dialogue with the communities here, the communities think that it is important for them that their stories run in another languages, go abroad and spread out abroad. So the idea behind it is to build this pressure, and then the government will do something, would act, is the idea behind it. But I always, I'm Brazilian, I work for Deutsche Welle news, a Brazilian news desk mainly. So my stories always go in Portuguese as well. They're always published in Portuguese. But of course, many women can't read Portuguese. Among these indigenous women, they speak their own languages. It's hard for them, because so this is why these gatherings are so important to them. But what is curious is that while I was filming and taking pictures and interview these women during this specific gathering, they couldn't communicate with each other as well, because there are hundreds of languages among the indigenous communities here in Brazil. So it was so interesting to see that Portuguese was the common ground, So it's hard, of course, to get the story published in all different indigenous languages. But I try to make sure the story will run in Portuguese at least, so they can read, they can understand, and I share the stories and pictures with them, and also video. Video is very popular among indigenous young people that they share through WhatsApp. So they also always ask, can you do a video, and so we could share. So it's a big challenge for me. But as I said, it's important for them that their story runs in other languages, that the international community get to know their problems and struggle.
I'd be happy to jump in. So I had a similar issue where the tribe that I was working with, it's the Gabra Tribe, and it's a very small number of people who speak the language. And so what I often do in these cases is my entry point often to these communities is through a community activist or a community leader who, you know, is able to kind of speak with me, work with my team, and then also is a member of the community and someone who is respected by the community. And so I find that that's a good way to do it, because it's very unlikely that the story would be published in Gabra. But I send it to folks like Nuria, who I mentioned earlier, and I request that she shares that story with the communities, because while, you know, cell phone use is pretty widespread in Kenya, this would be one of the places that really doesn't have it, internet or cell phone access. So that was how I dealt with that issue. And then the second question I wanted to speak to is the one about kind of how do you start doing these stories? And for me, I think just anecdotally, I started doing a lot of reporting on gender around the time of the Women's March, the first Women's March in the US. And I always was interested in human rights reporting. But I think that was the moment where I thought, you know, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And it made it very important to me as a woman to try to tell stories specifically about women. It became a passion. And I think I started to tell stories in kind of about women in every way, right? So sexual and reproductive health and rights, access to abortion, women in politics. And as I continue to tell those stories more and more, I feel like my worldview has really shifted. And so now I look at everything through a lens of, you know, what is this experience like for women and girls? Even if it seems like that experience may not have any kind of like gender angle to it, I think as many women on this call and in our audience know that there is always something that we deal with or experience differently than men, and men are often the ones telling the narrative and their voices are often the ones being heard. So that was how I got into it. And so when my colleagues and I considered the issue of climate change, we thought, well, of course, there must be a very different experience for women that's unique to women and girls. And that is how I specifically got into this story.
Yeah, similarly, Nicole Cebecky has been, you know, documenting and focusing on changing climates and the way it affects specifically women and girls for years. She's been based in East Africa for over a decade. So this is something that she has continuously focused on. And she even noted how remarkable it has been for even herself as you know, someone documenting these issues, how much change has happened over the past several years. And this doesn't really answer any of the questions, but I think in the fact that Nicole has been photographing these issues for such a long time sort of points to the importance of long-term storytelling. And, you know, thanks to organizations like the Pulitzer Center who, you know, fund that type of storytelling, which unfortunately due to budget cuts, you know, is becoming less and less common. And so that, you know, that's another reason why it's so important to continuously focus on these issues, because you develop that trust, because you develop that expertise and knowledge firsthand, because you're seeing it yourself. And in terms of publications, publishing in local languages or in the language of the community that, you know, is being documented, I think absolutely it's so crucial and so, you know, necessary. And I just hope that, you know, publications will sort of keep that at top of mind moving forward, you know, make sure that there's budget for that. And in my own case, you know, when an article isn't published in that language, I try my best to, you know, translated, at least for the people who are featured in the story, even if it's, a little broken, like, sorry. But this is, more or less, what the article is about, because it's important to disseminate that information to all communities, as Neha mentioned earlier. And, it's sort of, something that we hear time and time again, but never loses its sort of shock value. The fact that, the people who are suffering the most from climate change are the ones who have, zero to no carbon footprint. So it's important that these that these articles are being published in, countries that are contributing the most to climate change. But of course, it's important for, communities who are being photographed to have access to these stories as well. And then just to piggyback on what Nadia and Neha said about, how do you start focusing on these stories in the first place? I mean, I think collaboration through with people working in other sectors, so not necessarily journalists, but as Neha mentioned, activists or people who are leaders in their community is crucial. And thinking about how journalism can go beyond just, a printed story or a printed image or moving images, to thinking about increasing social impact, so how can our stories go on further to educate? So for example, in our Women on the Move story that was published in Nat Geo, the Pulitzer Center collaborated and created educational materials and curriculum for middle and high school students. And we've given many presentations throughout the United States about how women are affected by migration. And just last thing, our project was about women in migration, and Nicole's project looked at climate change. But what's so interesting about focusing on women's issues, because I myself as a photojournalist also focus primarily on women's issues, is that there's so many intersections. When you look at climate change or political instability or economic crises, women are always going to be there. Women are always going to, again, I mean, like I said earlier, I don't like to use the word suffer, but, like to bear the brunt of these consequences and to also be the ones who are looking for solutions. It's almost common sense. The people who are going to be affected the most are going to be the ones who know what the solution is. So those are my answers. Long-winded.
Sarah, I know we answered the question about research, so I'll jump in really quickly and just say that, and I don't research is really the crux of these stories. It's really important. We have all of these incredible, powerful anecdotal stories, but unless you have data and research to back it up, it's just a story. And so I think just to speak quickly to this, reading a lot of reports, studies, things that are published. And can you still hear me? Sorry, my computer's saying something weird. Yes. Okay. Kind of. I don't know what just happened. Sorry. But if you can still just hear me, it's data and research reports and trying to find people who are the head of both government and nonprofit and private sector organizations who can speak to these issues and provide us with the larger scale picture that will back up the individual stories.
Can I quickly add just a phrase? Science is a very important part of my work. So when I'm on the field listening to people, I always try to find papers about the topic. And there is always something published. There is always someone studying the topic for, I don't know, past 20, 30 years. So science is very important part of journalism as well, I would say.
I am so glad that you all mentioned that. And as I tell my students, the plural of anecdote is not data. It's really important to look at what the science is telling us. We just have a few minutes left. Unfortunately, our time has gone by so fast. So I would like to kind of end on a positive note and ask you if there's one thing that you took away, a piece of inspiration, or perhaps some change that you see on the ground. And maybe are there any bright spots out there where you see hope for the future? Each have about a minute.
Go ahead. Okay. I was just gonna, I think, starting with, as we mentioned, the women who are working on this issue, but I think also, if we're gonna look kind of big picture, right, and the young generation, I think that it's really important. I know that when I was in school, like generations ago, there was still a debate about whether climate change existed. And I know that there are still a small number of climate change deniers who are extremely, extremely loud, but I don't think there are that many, or I hope that there are not that many. And I think that, as we've brought up science and data and, the evidence, as we continue to look around the world, the numbers of climate crises and disasters are just mounting. We see more and more of them every day. California is on fire. Brazil's forests are burning down. There's cyclones, there's tsunamis. The evidence is really incontrovertible. And so I think that the young generation of kids and college students and people who are out in the streets protesting and telling politicians particularly that we need policies and we need to put into place laws that are going to protect the next generation of people, I think is just the most important thing. And I think that they're doing a damn good job of carrying the torch. So that would be one thing that I think is really positive.
You go ahead, Nadia. There's not a whole lot of time, so if you, yeah.
Okay. No, I actually would like to share Ana Terra's words here, because I told that these women that would be here today talking about them, and I asked them, what would you like you to say? What message would you like you to share? So Ana Terra, she is a young leader from the Yawalapiti ethnic group. And she wrote me, and I translated into English, and she said, I want to tell everyone not to stop protecting the environment. I want the right of women to be respected, as we are the ones who bring human beings into this world. I am devastated because we lose so many leaders and members to COVID-19, but we won't give up. And I send all the victims positive energy. If we all do our part, our planet will be saved. And we too, because the Indigenous women too, because the planet is sick and we have to save it from the destruction that human beings have been promoting. Thank you very much. My regards, Ana Terra, Yawalapiti, Indigenous activist. So, yeah.
That was beautiful, really beautiful. Thank you so much. I don't know, Danielle, if you can top that as your final word, and then we'll hand it back to Pulitzer.
Not really, but I guess just a lasting thing for all of us to think about, and something that Nicole had mentioned. We didn't get too much into COVID-19, but that's another layer, affecting women and all of us. But I think what COVID-19 has taught us, that Indigenous communities have already, known for millennia, is that our human impact affects the world. Like, hello. And COVID has shown us that, and it has all given us a time to reflect inside our homes, if you are not a frontline worker. So I think as we move forward, we should really hold dear these lessons that we've learned and really act, because we're at a pivotal moment, we're at a crossroads, and we can change our course, but we all have to work together to do it. So I think that's a beautiful message that Nadia shared just now to think about as we move forward from all of these crises.
We are all in this together, and it is more clear than ever how we need to really work together. Thank you so much to these panelists. I tried to get as many questions in as I could, and I'm going to have to hand it back to Pulitzer now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. We are so thankful to you, Danielle, Neha, and Nadia for today's conversation. A recording will be online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days, so please feel free to share that. Thank you to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Boyoung Lim. She was our intro to this session. She's having shaky internet, so I'm taking over here really quick. We do appreciate our audience for joining us today. And for those who are able, please remember that we are a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we do depend on donor support. Please donate today and become a Pulitzer Center champion at any level to gain exclusive benefits as part of our spring campaign. And please do check out pulitzercenter.org/events to see additional panels and events during our Environment Redefined conference. That link is down in the chat for you guys. Our next event is today, later this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, a really exciting workshop on processing climate change through poetry. Please stay with us for a few minutes longer for a very brief survey after we officially end today's session. And just once more, thank you for being with us today, and we hope to see you again throughout the week at the rest of our conference. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.